We have reached the great crossroads. Humanity is awakening. And all of you that have played your part in standing up to the censors, standing up to the bullies, and spreading the word are at the heart of this new renaissance. That's why, for myself, the entire InfoWars crew, I want to salute you all for what you've done in the information war and what you've also done on the streets peacefully. And why I'm asking you now more than ever to redouble your efforts, because victory is within sight.
Welcome back to the Alex Jones Show. I'm David Knight. Earlier in the show, we were talking about the interview with Dr. Pippa Malmgren that was transcribed on Zero Hedge, parts of it. It was with Eric Townsend's Macro Voices podcast. It was very interesting because she talked about blockchain, whether or not it was going to be controlled privately, or whether or not the governments were going to be able to take control of the coming blockchain currency to exercise even more control over the population. Or if we go in the other way, we move towards freedom. Very interesting times, isn't it? We have freedom sitting on the edge of a knife, don't we? That is the quest that we have here. But I want to talk about the other thing that she talked about before she got to the financial aspects of this. Now, she was in the Obama administration, and so as I point out on Zero Hedge, it was very interesting that despite her liberal views regarding the free movement of people, she said she was quite worried about the crisis that we're seeing in Europe right now. She believes that it will only worsen as governments in northern Africa become increasingly unstable, potentially leading to a financial crisis in Europe. Exactly. This is what she had to say. We're not just talking about the magnitude of refugees that we've already seen. We're talking about what's coming. And so this is where the Italian threat is very important. And the Italian threat she's speaking of is the threat of the Italian government saying, look, we're not going to put up with this anymore. We've got this massive exodus of people coming in from northern Africa, and they're coming straight here, and you're not helping us to patrol our borders. This is a massive invasion. If people can come to your country in uncontrolled, unvetted numbers, that's nothing short of an invasion. If you have absolutely no control over your borders, you have no control over your country, over your culture, over your economy, over anything, because people are just going to come in. And this was something that was a plan. I talked about this on Friday. The UN plan was documented back in 2000, 17 years ago. They were putting it out there saying, well, because of declining birth rates and because of an aging population, we got to bring these people in. We've got to have a replacement population. They were couching it in the terms that these people are going to come in and pay for our Social Security. Good luck with that. Good luck with that. No, what's really, that's the way that it was being sold. But what is really at the bottom of this is to bring massive numbers of people in to reduce the West to a third world controllable situation like they have been able to do in their colonization or their neo-colonization throughout the third world. And this is what she had to say. They said, basically, the Italians said, look, nobody is helping us. And we get all of them because of our geographical location. So unless you guys give us a hand here, then we're just going to issue them papers and we're going to let them loose through the rest of Europe. They can go anywhere they want in Western Europe. That is, of course, a bit scary for the rest of Western Europe, which would prefer to have the problem contained. But they're not prepared to help Italy in the containment process, just as they weren't prepared to give Greece any extra money to deal with their refugee problem, which happens for the same reasons. But this is just the beginning. And you have to understand, why is this happening? This policy, again, was sold 17 years ago, said we got to bring in people in massive numbers by the millions in order to sustain the welfare entitlement state that we have created in the West. That is not what this is about. And when you hear people talking about we got to bring them in because they've got a crisis, a refugee crisis, we've said for the longest time, they're creating these crises. This was the plan all along. The crisis in Africa is something that they created in Libya. And that's where many of these people are coming from. They created it. They created the crisis, the chaos, the regime change, the following wars that happened. And then they say, now we've got refugees, we've got to bring it in. That's what they wanted to do to begin with. And you have to understand that it was a plan to start with. That's why it's so important about Building 7, for example. If we go back and we look at 9/11 and we hear Silverstein say, pull it, and we see the building collapse, and we see the BBC coming on and announcing that Building 7, the third building that was never hit by a plane, that the third building had already fallen. And you can see the building over her shoulder while she's reading this, okay? That lie that they sold us to create the surveillance state. It's very important to understand that, because if you understand that they demolished Building 7, that it didn't fall down. We've never had a building that was that burned for a couple of hours, a steel skyscraper that just collapsed in its own footprint. Well, that happened 3 times, and only 2 times were the buildings even hit by a plane, if they want to try to explain it away that way. It was minor fires, minor office fires, and as we just saw the catastrophe in the UK, that building that burned, I think, for 18 hours. Never did fall down, did it? It just doesn't happen, folks. That isn't the way that the buildings fall down. They don't collapse in their footprint. So if you understand that these were controlled demolitions in the case of Building 7, it's very easy to see that with the BBC announcing that it had fallen. It hadn't fallen. With the guy being caught saying pull it, which is a term for demolition, and to see it collapse in its own footprint when it hadn't been hit by a plane. If you understand that, then you understand that it was something that they had planned for quite some time in advance. You don't just walk in and in a couple of hours set up a building for falling into its footprint. And the same thing is not happening for the collapse of the West either. This isn't something that just happened on the spur of the moment that they're reacting to. This is a long-term plan. That was their desire. So she goes on to say that what we're seeing now happening is not a temporary phenomenon. She said this is now that people in those parts of the world have begun to register, hey, I can just go to Europe because they've got telephones in their pocket. And the television is on their phone. So they're watching this happen. They're seeing the Western reports. And she said, this is the key. The realization that the movement may be worth it for these people in developing worlds. They're now saying that in parts of even sub-Saharan Africa, the greatest luxury good, the thing that a person will buy when they have any extra money, is passage to Europe. You understand that? That's what they're paying for. That's why they're coming. That is the plan. It is a planned demolition of the West to collapse it in its footprints. And, of course, this is a plan that they have been working on in terms of creating the so-called emergency events that are fueling this, as well as the attitudes of people in the West propagandizing our children. I'm going to go to that in just a moment. But remember that we do have an axis of people. We have the prime minister in Hungary and others. Poland is resisting this. The Czech Republic, Slovakia, they understand what's going on. And they're opposing the EU. And so as we talked about earlier, and I'll recap this on Breitbart, the Bavarian president is saying, we know that the migration wave will continue. The minister-president of Bavaria said he expects the migrant crisis to continue. He demanded that German Chancellor Angela Merkel do more to tackle it. He said, right now the situation is quiet, but we all know the immigration wave will continue. The cleanest way to solve it, he says, would be to help the refugees in their own home countries. How many times have I said that? We said, if you want to stop the refugees from Syria, why don't you stop the war that you created for regime change? Why don't you stop funding ISIS? And we have had President Trump stop funding ISIS via the CIA. He issued that order last week. That's a positive move and the right step. We could stop the war. That would be a great help to these people. They really would like to stay in their own country rather than being uprooted and moved across the world. And we could do that if we stop the wars that we're fomenting in those countries. We could help them in their own countries. But no, that's not the plan from the UN. That's not the plan from the EU. It's not the plan from Merkel. Chancellor Merkel suspended the rules requiring asylum seekers to lodge a claim in the first safe European nation that they enter in 2015. And she said back then there was going to be no upper limit on the number of migrants that Germany would accept. Pushing back against that, we have Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban criticizing George Soros. He understands that George Soros is working with these people to make this happen, and the European Union. He says what they're seeking is a new, mixed, Muslimized Europe. They want to eradicate Western civilization and culture because it makes it easier for them to dominate people, just as they have done in the colonial period and the neo-colonial period. He says the European Union, the European Commission, must regain independence from the Soros empire before the billionaire finishes his program for the destruction of the continent. He knows exactly what this is. People in Hungary know exactly who George Soros is. They are not deceived by that man for a moment. Now, we're talking about how they prepared this in terms of education. There's an interesting article that's come out last couple of days, and Drudge has a link to one of these. And there's a California chancellor of the community college system who has said, we need to get rid of algebra. He says, getting rid of algebra is a civil rights issue. Did you realize that? They don't want you or your children or anyone to be educated. They want you to be dependent. The school system is not about educating your children. It's about propagandizing you and your children. And he said in an interview last Wednesday, he said it is a civil rights issue. He said, since the 1950s, we decided that the only measure of a student's ability to reason or to do some sort of quantitative measure is algebra. What we're saying is we want as rigorous a course as possible to determine a student's ability to succeed, but it should be relevant to their course of study. Let me say something to you. I use algebra on a daily basis. Perhaps many of you have seen the YouTube clip that's kind of funny, but incredibly sad, where one girl is videotaping her friend sitting in the front seat, and she says, we're going 80 miles. If we're going 80 miles an hour, how long is it going to take us to go 80 miles? And the girl's like, what? 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 Say that again? And they go back and forth, and she just cannot figure it out. Well, folks, that's basically algebra. Algebra is not high-level math. It's one of the lowest-level math courses you can take. I went into engineering. I took a lot of math classes that I don't use. I took calculus. I took things far past calculus that I don't use on a daily basis. I do use algebra on a daily basis, however. I used algebra on a daily basis when I had a business. It is part of being able to think critically. It's very basic math. The next thing they'll be telling you is that you should know that 2 + 2 is equal to 4. Oh, I'm sorry, they already did that with Common Core, didn't they? They don't even want you to know basic arithmetic. They don't want you to be educated. The purpose of education used to be to create independent thinkers. They used to call it a liberal education because it would liberate you to follow and to have the tools of learning so that you could follow your own interests into things, so that you could pursue your own education. It is not a bucket that you fill, but it is a fire that you light, and you give people the tools to pursue that fire. That's what education is, but they don't want education. And we had Charlotte Iserby as well as Phyllis Schlafly tell us at the beginning of the Reagan administration, when they went to Washington to work with the Department of Education, they were hoping they could shut the thing down. That's what we had been promised by Ronald Reagan when he ran for president. He was going to shut down the Department of Education. As I said before, it was like Rosemary's Baby. It was this monster in a cradle. It was less than 4 years old. Jimmy Carter had created that thing. And Ronald Reagan said, rightfully so, the federal government has no place in setting up education, shouldn't be involved, should not be involved in any way, shape, or form. That doesn't belong to the federal government. I would argue it doesn't belong to government at any level. But it certainly doesn't belong to the federal government. We need to keep education as close to the parents and the individual as possible. We should have local control of that. Instead, it has been moving in the opposite direction. It went from the parents to the community to the state, from the state to the federal government. And it's going to go from there to the United Nations. That's part of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. They will determine what the children need to know to be good citizens of the United Nations. That's a paraphrase, but not a rough paraphrase of their own document. They want you to be subservient members to them. It's education to them. It's about propaganda. It is about manipulating the way that you think. It is about taking away the tools of learning. And so when you look at this and they're saying, well, this is a civil rights issue, you need to take control of your own education, the education of your children. You need to say, well, what is the purpose of education? Is it to make me more intelligent? Is it to give me the tools of learning? Or is it to give me a piece of paper and credentials? Yes, those can be useful in terms of getting a job for somebody else. But if you really want to succeed in life, you really need the real thing, folks. We need to get past these boxes that they put us in. We need to think past these institutions that they offer us, these institutions like schools. You don't need a school for an education. It can be useful, but it can also be detrimental, as we're seeing right here. We got to get rid of algebra. We don't want our kids to think. And this is a civil rights issue. No, if you really cared about civil rights, you would want to challenge these kids to think critically. That's the whole purpose. Think of algebra just as a critical thinking issue, but it has real-world ability. Connected to this, we see on the Daily Mail this story, a spoof from a neurology expert. He creates a scientific paper and he sprinkles it with Star Wars stuff, and he sends it out to these different organizations to see if these journals will publish it. neurology expert, revealed they were able to convince a trio of medical journals to publish a Star Wars-themed fake manuscript, despite it being packaged full of references to George Lucas's Star Wars series. It was titled Mitochondria, Structure, Function, and Clinical Relevance. It was poorly written. It was an absurd mess of factual errors, plagiarism. Yeah, because they were taking lines directly out of the movie. He said, I wanted to test whether predatory journals would publish an obviously absurd paper, wrote the author. He said, so I created a spoof manuscript about midi-chlorians, the fictional entities that live inside cells and give Jedi Knights their powers in Star Wars. He said, I filled it with other references to a galaxy far, far away. And he gave it to 9 journals. And he did it under the name of Dr. Lucas McGeorge and Dr. Anakin. They published it. And let me just read a little bit of this because it's actually kind of funny. It starts out, sounds very technical, and then it just starts quoting from Star Wars. He says, midichlorian-mediated oxidative stress causes cardiomyopathy in type 2 diabetics. As more fatty acids are delivered to the heart and into cardiomyocytes, the oxidation of fatty acids in these cells increases. Did you ever hear the tragedy of Darth Plagueis the Wise? I thought not. It is not a story the Jedi would tell you. It was a Sith legend. Darth Plagueis was a dark lord of the Sith, so powerful and so wise that he could use the Force to influence the midi-chlorians and to create life and so on and so forth. I mean, we really need Alex Jones here doing his spot-on imitation of James Earl Jones doing Darth Vader to do relevance to this. But it just shows that when you see something in scientific journals and when they tell you that we have a consensus, and that we know that there's global warming going on, you need to be able to think independently. But they don't want you to think independently. That's why they don't even want you to know not even just algebra, but basic arithmetic. They don't want you to think. But they also want to control what you see. Remember, we had the story earlier about the Minnesota school system adopting all kinds of a transgender toolkit that will go down to kindergarten people. And they're going to expunge the language of any gender-specific stuff. Well, in the UK, we've also got an organization there that is demanding that queer theology be taught in seminaries, erasing all religious freedom. This is a stunning document. It's a story from WND, a stunning document released by Wilton Park, an agency of the Foreign Office. It recommends that the Bible be reinterpreted to make it compatible with LGBTI theology, whatever that is, okay? This is pointed out by the Barnabas Fund. This is where it goes, folks. They have absolutely no interest in free speech and people who have control of their own lives. Our educational system is about propagandizing people because it's run by the government. You want to talk about fake news and how they lie to people? They're lying to your children in school. Or if you're in school, they're lying to you. You need to be able to think for yourself. They don't want you to have those tools. Stay with us. When we come back, we're going to give you some more tools to think about. We're going to talk about taking control of your food source. How about that? A novel idea from Maine. We'll be right back.
What the aging process is when the cell replicates, we lose a little bit of our telomeres. Telomeres are the little cups on the end of our chromosomes.
And when it runs out, you start dying.
Secure your DNA force today at InfoWarsLife.com.